See, one way to try to persuade people is to say, I am completely right and you are completely wrong. My beliefs are all right and your beliefs are all wrong. Does that sound persuasive? Here's a better way to do it. Number two, and some people, by the way, many Christians don't like it when I say this. I'm warning you just in case you want to get ready to not like what I'm about to say. Are you prepared? When you speak to non-Christians, you must tell them what the Bible says, but you should also quote their own prophets. That's a metaphor. Every group of people has certain authorities that they respect. They have authors or actors or speakers that they have great reverence for. So as much as possible, you tell them what the Bible says, but you try to bring the authorities that they respect in and quote them to help them understand the truth. A very good example of this is in Acts chapter 17. Paul's preaching to the philosophers on Mars Hill, and he quotes pagan philosophers. Now, this is a Christian speaker, but if you read the commentaries, you'll see that he quotes Epimenides, another Greek poet named Aratus, I think. Now, what is a Christian speaker doing quoting pagan philosophers? If you closely look at the quotes in Acts 17, one of the quotes is where Paul quotes a man who says, "In him we live and move and have our being," is speaking about God. And another quote is, "We are his offspring," speaking about God. Now, these pagan philosophers were polytheists, and these quotes actually are not completely consistent with polytheism. But Paul recognizes that they were speaking truth there. In spite of all their erroneous views, they had many erroneous wrong views, of course. But Paul picked out the things they said that were true, and he knew that the people he was talking to respected those men. Now, I believe that when Christian speakers are speaking to non-believers, they have to do the same thing. But let me just give you a couple examples that you probably would be familiar to you. When I'm preaching in America, if I ever can quote Martin Luther King Jr., the very famous African-American civil rights leader, because in American culture, he is very revered and honored as like a saint. Just like Paul, I would quote him even though I don't accept everything he would teach or say. But I need to take the things he says that are really true and right and use them to an audience of non-Christians. If I say to non-Christians, the Bible says this, and Martin Luther King Jr. says the same thing, the audience will accept it. Because I'm using both the Bible, which they have some respect for, but Martin Luther King Jr., who they have tremendous respect for. If I make a point using both the Bible and an authority they respect, I've established it and I can move on to the next point. If I only quote the Bible, probably won't be completely convinced, and I can't move on. Do you see how that works? I'm not going to give you other examples because they'd all be from my cultural context and wouldn't be as useful for you. But I certainly hope you understand that second point. Okay, third point. When speaking to non-Christians, and especially postmodern non-Christians, you have to show that you are sympathetic to their doubts and you understand their doubts and their concerns. In the book of Jude in the New Testament, there's a very interesting verse where it says, "Be merciful to those who doubt." That's a command, and yet an awful lot of Christian speakers are not very merciful to people with doubts. You have to show doubters that you understand what it's like not to believe. You have to show that you understand what it's like. You understand their skepticism. You understand their concern. Let me give you a story. I was speaking to an evangelist, a man who travels around the world and who preaches the gospel on college campuses. So he gets up in front of university students who are many atheists or agnostics or secular, and he presents the gospel, and then he takes questions, and he gives answers to questions. He's done this all over the world. One time he had just finished speaking and taking questions, and he dismissed everyone, and people left. But one student came forward, and he said, "I'm having trouble understanding you." He said, "I've never met a Christian like you." He says, "What I want to know, are you a Christian losing your faith, or are you an atheist becoming a Christian?" And the evangelist said, "What in the world are you talking about?" He said, "Well, on the one hand, you have very strong moral beliefs. You have very, very clear convictions about God and about truth. But you're so kind to people who doubt. You listen, and you're so understanding, and you're so careful with them. I've seen doubters who were very nice and kind, but didn't have strong beliefs. And I've seen Christian speakers who were really not very nice to doubters. They were very harsh with them. But I've never seen someone with such strong convictions who was so kind and patient with doubters. And the evangelist said, "Oh, I know what you mean. You see the effect of the gospel." He said, "If I believed that I was saved by my good works, if I believed that I was going to heaven because I study the Bible and I obey the Ten Commandments, that I was saved through my good works, well, then of course I'd feel superior to people who didn't believe. I say, I'm saved because of my commitment. Yeah. So if you're not committed, you're inferior to me." And he says there actually are a lot of people who claim to be Christians, but that's their belief. But he says that's not real Christianity. That's not the gospel. The gospel is I'm saved as a sinner in spite of my sin. I'm not saved by my work, I'm saved by Christ's work for me. So how could I possibly feel superior to anybody? Saved because of Jesus, not because I'm such a good person. The doubter I'm talking to could be a much more moral and nice person than me. So I'm sorry you're confused, but that's the kind of person that the gospel creates. Now the trouble with that story, which is true by the way, was the evangelist had to make himself the hero of his own illustration. But it worked. Because the student said, "Tell me more about that gospel." And that's our third point. You need to go out of your way to show that you understand doubters, you're patient with them, you understand what it's like not to believe. Now here's the fourth point. You need to try to persuade people using their own beliefs against them. That's the fourth point. It's a little bit like the second point, but it's not the same. See, one way to try to persuade people is to say, "I am completely right and you are completely wrong. My beliefs are all right and your beliefs are all wrong." Does that sound persuasive? It's not. But here's a better way to do it. You look into the person's life and you see something that they believe that's right and good. And you point to that and say, "You believe that? Me too, I believe that. That's what the Bible says as well. So you and me and the Bible, we all agree that that belief is right. But if you believe that, why don't you believe this over here?" You see, what you're doing is you're using their own beliefs against them. You're trying to persuade them of this because they already believe that. If you read the Bible carefully, you'll see that's the way persuasion always happens. It's the way Paul does it in every one of his speeches and sermons in Acts. Number 5, you need to help non-Christians wish Christianity were true so that they can sit still to hear a case on why it is true. About 20 years ago, about 3 Korean pastors from New York City came to see me. And they had noticed that a lot of their young people were not coming to church. A lot of their young people had grown up in the church, but when they got to be college age, they stopped coming. But some of their young people had started coming to Redeemer Church, where I was the pastor. And they came to me, but they were trying to understand the dynamic. Why was it happening? So with fear and trembling, and I gave them this answer.